Thank you so much for your eminent presence here today. Over to Dr. Anurag.
Thank you so much, Mr. Billimoria. The reason they haven't put your 10 card is they want to give you an opportunity to be whoever you want to be. When I grow up, I'm clear I want to be like Mr. Dr. C. Rajkumar for various reasons, but I'm sure your name card will come. But we couldn't have had a better panel. We have Mr. Butani joining us virtually. I'm sure there is a VC going on where billing is on. That's very important. But let me formally, all these three stalwarts on my panel don't really need an introduction. We also have virtual. This is being streamed live on bwlegalworld.com and businessworld.in. But let me say, Dr. C. Rajkumar, I started to know him better in the last few years. But I can say I bother him a lot because a lot of my friends got to know that I know him. And they come for admissions. And I figured out those are very brilliant students. But they still haven't made it to his university, especially the law one I'm talking. So he's built an institution in less than 12 years, and he has tremendous energy. He keeps doing new things and raising the bar. So please give him a big round of applause, because if we are going to do what we want to do in the legal services domain, in business and economy, we need the right talent. During the lockdown, I was doing a BW healthcare dialogue with a healthcare entrepreneur, and possibly the top 3 healthcare professionals in India. And he said the problem with India is, unlike the engineering services and engineering in technology, the medical services is very restricted in terms of talent. Because in engineering, we built a TCS, Wipro, Cognizant, Tech Mahindra, I can go on at least 10 firms like that. Because there are so many engineering colleges, there's no cap, you can start, it's easier. But when it comes to medical and healthcare, you know how the system, Anurag, is. So really, talent is the single biggest need for any industry. You can have everything. So thank you for creating the right talent. And I know now that over the last 2 years, we've been involved with BW Legal World. The OP Jindal University, especially its legal course, is much in demand. Not only, he had to create a supplementary course to cater to the demand, because I had a situation 2 weeks back where somebody really chased me to meet him, and he was kind and courteous. After he took 2 hours to explain him and say no, and gave him food and all that. So he did it very nicely. But I know that he's built a very fantastic university, and its best is yet to come. So please give Mr. C. Rajkumar a big round of applause. Again, Mr. Billimoria, I haven't had the good pleasure of knowing personally. I've never met you, so my congratulations to you and my condolences to you, Mr. Rajkumar. But really, again, we don't have to introduce Dr. Billimoria. Today, he's going to talk primarily about how we can bring in more FDI and all. If you bring in more FDI, a lot of structural things need to be done right. And also, what is the future of law? How do we structurally change it? So he'll talk a bit about that. Dr. Pinky Anand, again, she doesn't really need an introduction. She's been in the government. She's an eminent lawyer. She has a very large practice. And she's a very kind person, I can say that. Last but not the least, Mr. Mukesh Bhutani. Again, he doesn't really need an introduction. He's recently written a book which is doing very well. And, he's very content-centric. He writes very often. We would like him to write for us more often. Also, Mr. Rajiv Luthra is not being able to join us either virtually or physically, though he'll be here for the awards. I also want to acknowledge the presence of Ms. Manjari Chaudhary, who's the GC for Maruti, and somebody who's very well respected in the profession. I also like to acknowledge the presence of Mr. Hemant Kumar. He's the Group GC of L&T. Thank you, both of you, for coming. And in the morning, I said that we want to be the homepage of GCs. Of course, law firms are very important. Law schools are very important. But we are very clear. When you see the magazine tonight, we want to be the homepage of... And councils, of course. If spring comes, can winter be far behind? But now let's dive into the topic of how we can bring in more FDI. And all, somebody who is very well respected in the profession. I also like to acknowledge the presence of Mr. Hemant Kumar. He's the GC for Maruti, and somebody who's the promises to keep and miles to go. What are structural changes needed from the legal side to enable business? That's what we are essentially discussing. Let me start by inviting first Mr. C. Kumar to talk about what he believes needs to be done in terms of talent terms, because again, talent is a very large part of that. Mr. C. Kumar. You can take this. You can.
Thank you, Anurag, and thank you, Businessworld and BW Legal for hosting this conference. I do think that one of the big challenges that we are facing today across professions is the fact that our education system has not catered to the full aspirations of what the profession is. Speaking about legal education itself, which I believe is in many ways going to shape the future. We have 1,600 plus law schools in India, and we are graduating nearly 100,000 lawyers every year. And the reality is, most of these law schools and law students are hugely unprepared to contribute in any meaningful manner to any aspect of legal profession. And I'm not only speaking in terms of corporate law firms and in-house counsel, but also litigation. So in some ways, I worry about the fact that we are institutionalizing mediocrity across the legal profession without recognizing the significant adverse consequences for the future. In fact, today, if you look at delays in courts when it comes to litigation, or for that matter, improper advice or other forms of bottlenecks within the corporate legal practice, part of the problem is that at the supply side itself, we don't have enough students, graduates, who are coming into the profession. Now, mind it, we have come a long way from the time when many of us had gone to law school. The reality, I come from a place called Kanyakumari in Tamil Nadu, and I grew up in Chennai, and when I decided to study law, this was 1990s, many of my relatives met my parents and said, "What happened to Raj? He was a good student." And that scenario of people who didn't have anything better to do in life, who probably have failed to enter into medicine, engineering, and so many other things, coming into law, that has changed. Today, some of the best and the brightest young people are coming into legal profession through legal education, but unfortunately, we don't have enough top-notch law schools, and that ought to be the priority when it comes to the legal profession. I must end by saying that I have been hugely disappointed that neither the litigating bar, nor the corporate bar, nor the judiciary has responded to this challenge in any meaningful manner, and they have seen law schools as merely recruitment grounds for their own interests, with little or no contribution whatsoever for strengthening the legal education.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rajkumar, on focusing on the talent side, and we'll come back to you in terms of what they could do. But let me bring in Mr. Billimoria. And Mr. Billimoria, apart from being a legal professional, you were trained as a chartered accountant, right? And I know Mr. Butani is here. He was also trained as a chartered accountant. Of course, if you have to practice law, you have to give up on that. You can only do one. So let me ask you by starting, is corporate India getting spooked by heavy-handed regulatory investigations? Let me start by asking a very direct question. It's working?
First of all, let me say what a pleasure it is to be on the panel, especially with two very close friends whom I've known, I think, for the last 3 decades. One is Mukesh, of course. Mukesh and I started off as colleagues, and of course, my very good friend Pinky. I think, the corporate India probably is getting a little spooked, but probably for the wrong reasons. First of all, let me tell you that it is a good thing if there is a cleanup, right? So we have to follow the rule that if there is somebody who has something to worry about, should be worried. But at the same time, we have to make sure that there is a system in place so that there is no witch hunt that is going on. Now, the social media and the TV channels tend to blow up this situation a little beyond what it really is. But in terms of investigation, I think corporate India also has to get over this hang-up. And I'll tell you my personal experience. There was a very senior retired bureaucrat, and in fact, I was in a closed-door meeting.
Then we also have marketing intangibles. Now, transfer pricing aspects of marketing intangibles again have been a focus area for the Indian transfer pricing administration. The issue is particularly relevant to India, given its unique market-specific characteristics such as location advantages,
somebody didn't like what I said.
No.
large customer base,
I'm sure we'll
market
fix this.
premium.
Garima, can you get this
Indian
fixed?
customers, etc.
Can you get this fixed?
The Indian market has witnessed substantial marketing activity by the subsidiaries and related parties of the.
Thank you for that update.
Sorry. So there was a very senior, there was a very senior bureaucrat, and I was in a closed-door meeting, with him and a few clients. And to my astonishment, he said that, corporate India has a lot to worry about because it's no longer the case that if there's somebody at your doorstep, then you can pick up the phone and, ask for him to be called away. And I was aghast because why would you, if there is somebody from a agency who is there to ask questions, why would you want a regime where you can pick up the phone, right? And that's the be-all, end-all. I mean, I think, there have been a lot of scams in the country. Our banking sector today is of biggest concern. Credit is very tight. In fact, one of the reasons why I think the law firms are busy, as we heard, on the previous panel, is because of the credit squeeze. There are a lot of people doing private equity kind of deals. So we have to clean up a little.
Also, when you say clean up, would you qualify? And what do you mean by clean up? Can you build on that?
Sure. So let me tell you one thing very squarely. When we talk about FDI, if you're talking to a client who is in the West, we have got ourselves a slightly bad name. Because if you look at some of the commercial litigation that is ongoing and which has happened over the last couple of decades at least, the crux of the litigation has been, somebody...
The governance was weak, let's put it this way.
Well, governance was weak, or, somebody's trying to run circles around a foreigner who doesn't know the lay of the land. And I think that's a bad reputation that we've got. We've got to step out of it, because today the biggest challenge we have is the supply chains are being restructured, and we have to step into China's shoes. And if we have to do that, we have to have a little bit of a cleanup. It's imperative.
And so, another question I want to ask you, do you think, are the Indian courts venturing into the domain of the executive and legislature too much? I mean, of course they're venturing, but is it getting to a point where it's really becoming counterproductive to the efforts that, say, the government does or the finance minister does to attract talent and attract money? Give us your candid view.
Right. So this is again a little vexed situation, because when you say venturing into legislature, we have to understand, when we say government, there are two governments. Do you mean parliament or do you mean the executive? Because if you ask me my personal opinion, the biggest problem in this country, and that again impacts FDI, is the gargantuan bureaucracy. That is something that we have to reform. We need bureaucratic reforms. That's again another key factor that we have to implement if we are going to look at FDI, right? And in legislation, there is this concept of delegated legislation. So delegated legislation means that Parliament enacts a law, and Parliament is well within its rights to enact any law it pleases, subject to judicial review. But when Parliament enacts a law and it delegates a part of the rule-making authority to the bureaucracy, and then the bureaucracy tends to overreach, that is also subject to judicial review. And there I don't think the courts can hold back. The courts have been, in fact, very restrained in that particular area. At the same time, I know that there is criticism. Some of my friends in the West, for example, will marvel at, oh, so your Supreme Court has the power to do this, to speak on, say, for example, environment or stuff like that. Those are all policy issues, which I think the judiciary.
But sometimes judicial activism is needed to get action going. So because that's where the buck stops, so to say.
Right. But the rule here is very clear, and in fact the courts have also said this. It is really the process. So the courts will not intervene in a policy issue. But if the policy is arbitrary, manifest arbitrariness, that is
Or
the
is
word.
not implemented.
Or is not implemented or implemented in the wrong way, or if there is some overreach, then courts are the check and balance, rightly so.
Thank you, Mr. Rajkumar. You want to make a point before we bring in Ms. Pinky
I
Anand?
just want to add on the question of whether courts are overstepping. One of the major problems I also see is that on many areas, particularly on economic and financial and surrounding public policy is concerned, courts do end up doing things at a little bit premature manner. And we also see that those matters, when the court intervene, they don't have enough understanding of the law and economics dimension. So there is a huge capacity building and learning that has to happen within the courts itself, because these are now become extremely technical matters.
Yes.
And lawyers are not used to thinking, lawyers are generally used to thinking all or nothing, but economics requires a different type of thinking, and that's why if you look at European approach towards decision making in all these matters, law and economic analysis is used frequently in these matters, and unfortunately we don't have enough capacity.
Yeah, so if you're talking crypto, you're talking of blockchain, you're talking gaming, there are new areas where there are lots of gray areas, and that requires a super nuanced approach. I think that's what you're referring to, because if we are going to create a GDP of 5 trillion, we'll have to embrace these domains. And they have their own dangers. We know about crypto. A lot of wrong elements have got into crypto. So we need to clean that up. But we'll come to that in a moment. Let me bring in Dr. Pinky Anand. You are unique in the sense you worked in the government. You worked outside the government. Politically, you are involved. And you interface with almost every stakeholder that matters. What is your view on this interface between business and law? And what do you think can be done to really keep the promises that have been made in the past?
Anurag, I think we've come across a time when the government, the country, is looking at progress as an initiative, as a morale booster, if you like, or to bring it on the roadmap. So therefore, the commercial concerns, the concerns of the economy progressing, and indeed, in fact, Mohit was talking about the GDP growth just on the panel back, is something that the government has been concentrating on. But what I think is the most fascinating part, and I'll come to the legal part, I have this crisis at times. I interface policy, public life, political life, legal life, all in one kind of bucket. And because of that, my thinking somehow always goes in that horizon. So if the first thought is what the government has been actually doing. And so when I travel across, that last 3 days back I was in Uttaranchal. In fact, I was held up in the landslides while trying to progress beyond to some very pretty places. Be that as it may, some part of it, forget the Munshiari part, which was horrific in terms of traveling, but prior to that, and I've traveled through the country, the infrastructure growth. I think the infrastructure growth has been phenomenal. We may not have been able to do as well with the Char Dham. We started it. I was part of that case, in fact, where we tried to get, and that's a conflict between environment, by the way, and development, this constant conflict. But at the same time, the infrastructural growth across the country has been phenomenal. So right from Vajpayeeji's time, when he started the quadrangle and the entire movement, the highways and the traveling itself is an initiative, not only to traveling per se, but to the industry, because it ultimately is a hallmark of development in that process. You talk about that, you talk about things like Swachh Bharat. You may say that this is not a subject which necessarily goes to commerce, but it does. The whole initiative of building up and to ensure, now again, this conflict of environment and development. Environment, it saves on carbon dioxide emissions to a major extent, aside from cleanliness and hygiene, which goes a long way into a civic sense, as well as promoting initiatives across the world. The main feature, now coming to law, I mean, these are initiatives, and then you have the Atal Mission for rejuvenation, solar energies, building of water reservoirs, building of solar panels all over the country, building of trees, putting of trees. But coming to the legal part of it, I think in the legal domain, what India has been trying to do, and we've been reasonably successful, we really have to move forward constantly from time to time, is the manner in which we've been able to develop the commercial jurisprudence. So you have the development of, for example, arbitration. Now, arbitration is something that has been developing in leaps and bounds across the country, and then, of course, as representatives across the world. We have even pulled back on some of the things. The government has pulled back on a couple of initiatives which have really lent to credibility as far as the Indian economy is concerned, and even on bilateral investment treaties to promote business. So everything, law is actually a successor in a way to business. It is a precursor on the third leg. So you have three legs. You have business, law, business. So it moves in that direction, I believe. And I think the way in which we are trying to develop the law to promote business in the first instance as a policy as well as regulations. Second is to make our law more efficient so that we can actually give returns to people who may be dissatisfied or who want redressal, because everybody looks for returns. In business, you look for returns, and law helps you get that process through. And if you can't, then redressal in other terms. So this entire movement of this tri-legal kind of circumference is something that is being moved towards, both in terms of commercial courts, in terms of arbitration, in terms of Companies Act. I think the number of liability issues that have come up in the Companies Act and the answerability that we are having across corporate, we still have scams, by the way. There's no dearth of scams, but I think jab tak duniya rahegi, tab tak crime bhi rahega. I mean, that kind of goes in the process. We can only minimize the impact and to ensure that it doesn't go beyond a certain phase and we are able to protect the citizens. So there are very large chapters in this, but we have increased in leaps and bounds, and I think everybody is looking at India as a destination in any case. The numbers, of course, the first thing for India is numbers. The second thing is the intelligence. I think the intelligence that we have, not only in law, and with the Jindal University, as we talk, well, Rajkumar is here, which is incidentally the best as far as the country is concerned, and we come in the international globe with that respect. But indeed, the knowledge, the intelligence, the technology, and the verve we have is something that stands for itself. All we need to do at times is to put it together and to present it as a wholesome package, including the legal aspects of how to take it forward.
Thank you so much, Mr. Anand. I think we have a technical glitch for the first time since the morning. And we'll have Mr. Butani soon. Soumyajit and Garima, I hope we can get Mr. Butani soon. But let me also, Krishnan, can you take a mic? And I want to at some stage bring in Manjriji and Hemanji into the conversation. It would have been nice because they would bring the corporate kind of point of view. They work with large corporates that are L&T and Maruti, both are bellwether companies. They are the leaders in the industries that they're in. I want to ask you, policy consistency. Now, when I talk to CEOs, promoters, investors, the first thing they talk about is policy consistency. Whatever be the policy, whatever be the slab of text, whatever, the first thing, I mean, if I had to, they don't even are worried about compliance. That's cost of compliance, and compliance is a second item. What do you have to say on that? Mr. Rajkumar, then Mr. Billimoria, and hopefully we'll have Mr. Bhutani by then.
Well, this is a very serious concern because I think both national and international corporations, companies, business enterprises are looking at consistency when it comes to planning as well. When they are investing significant amount of resources, they do expect that they should, of course, follow the rules and regulations and have compliances. But then they are also expecting that there is, even if there is change in government, state or central, the random policy changes will affect their own ability to have long-term planning in business as well. So I think it's a very important aspect that we've not paid enough attention. I mean, there are so many instances in which this has created, or let's say, shaken the trust that investors have. The second aspect of this is that we also should remember this competitive edge that India has a as a country, as a market, as a democracy, as a broadly rule of law society, these variables are good enough only to the extent that they are able to protect the interest of the investors as well. The moment there is greater degree of uncertainty when it comes to those investments, sooner than later, people are going to think, you know what, there are possibly other countries in South and Southeast Asia, maybe even Africa. No longer, companies are wedded to individual countries. In fact, the fact remains even today that more and more, heads of states and heads of governments are ready to woo industry to invest in their own countries, and India cannot take it for granted that because of all these other things that we are doing so well, investors are going to line up and will remain here forever.
Absolutely. Mr. Billimoria, your nuanced point of view?
Yes, so I'll take this opportunity to also underline what I said earlier, which is, thank you. Cost of compliance may be secondary, but that we must make sure that we clean up red tape. That's something
you said
which
very loudly.
Yeah. As far as policy is concerned, I think, I'm sure my friend Mukesh will talk a little more about it, but nothing exemplifies this better than the fact that we have had an Income Tax Act since 1961, which has been amended every year, every budget. In fact, I think it would be very interesting to see, some of the budget announcements and how many of those, from the policy perspective, have actually been implemented. And you take the opportunity every year to tinker with customs duty and excise duty, depending on what you think needs to be done. I think it's a complete mess. So we have to have one, unified view on policy. And, the other big example is, of course, disinvestment. I think in both these scenarios, I think the Modi government has, taken the initiative and done something. Thank God for it. Even in terms of cutting red tape, I think, e-governance and these kind of initiatives are going to pay off in the long run. But policy, you're absolutely right. We need a uniform policy on each industry. And that policy should be stated. Policy is not just about monetary policy or import-export policy, half of which is pious platitudes. There's no reason to amend the Income Tax Act every year. For what?
Thank you. We have Mr. Bhutani now, and I can say that having interacted with him so often, he's always the calm one, even in a situation we wasted your time. Apologies for that. Mr. Bhutani, your view, first on policy consistency, because most of the investors and entrepreneurs complain about that, and overall comments in terms of what can the legal world do to make the business world a better place to do business.
Thank you very much for having me, and it's good to be amongst friends. Just taking forward the point that my friend Percy was making on the policy front, I think the biggest thing that any business needs, not just foreign investors, is a certainty in the policy. A case in point clearly are the recently concluded Hague Arbitral Awards for both Kane and Vodafone, where one investor was seeking certainty, which it felt was granted by the Supreme Court in 2012. And the other investor was seeking certainty because the very basis of the law that was applied to it, the retrospective law, was applied much after the transaction was concluded. So I think certainty, in my view, is the key. If I have to attribute few reasons why there are frequent uncertainties in our policy, I would attribute that one to the reason that was alluded earlier, which is the flip-flop of policy that we see. Until and unless you lay down a white paper, why do you have this policy? What is the longevity of this policy? And what would be those circumstances that would lead to change in policy? No fiscal policy will work. The second is that the flip-flop of the policy has been occurring too frequently due to what we call it as the menace of retrospectivity. And we've seen the outcome of that and the impact of that on investments and the investment environment in general. The third, in my view, is that whenever we come out, we are a country, we are a nation infested with overburden of regulations and law. However, our track record to administer that law is abysmally poor. So that's the other challenge. I also see that laws that are hurriedly legislated, even though they may go through the formal parliamentary process, we do not focus enough on the drafting of the law. Very often you'll come across courts giving interpretation of the new law, which either hasn't been drafted appropriately or the subordinate legislation to prepare the law has not been given enough thought to. The last part I would attribute is that if there is a law passed by the parliament, if there is a subordinate legislation which has either been tabled in the parliament or issued by the executive, and the court interprets the law, there is nothing in a constitution that precludes the lawmakers from clarifying the intent of the policy so that at least future litigation can be prevented. So I would say that these are, in my view, a small list of issues on which the investor is seeking certainty. And I know that these are all generic in nature, but I think there are areas in which we have done a better job, and there are areas we haven't particularly done a better job. So if you look at the manner in which some of our regulators, particularly the capital markets regulators like SEBI or the Competition Commission, some of these newly formed regulators are working, we have done a far better job than some of our old regulations that are working, including in particular the Arbitration and the Conciliation Act. Just a case in point on Arbitration and Conciliation Act, just look at mediation. Time and again, the Supreme Court emphasizes on the concept of mediation. The Civil Procedure Code of 1908 also envisaged a concept of mediation, but there is no domestic umbrella legislation just for mediation. We have a legislation for arbitration and not for mediation. And this is despite the fact that the Supreme Court had to then take this unique step to say, okay, we should set up a panel to first draft the law. We should accord legal sanctity to disputes that could be settled through mediation. And the emphasis on the draft legislation clearly are the best practices that the court has prescribed: confidentiality, voluntary nature of process, neutrality, avoiding conflict, so on and so forth. So that's just an illustration I wanted to make a mention about.
Thank you so much, Mukesh. Let me bring in Mr. Hemant Kumar and Ms. Manjari into the conversation. Mr. Kumar, you heard, let's say, government, educational institution, and a practitioner. I mean, I'm simplifying. Of course, you're all. What is your view as a corporate advisor, if I may use? The GCs have a board seat. They help save money. One decision done right from a regulatory or legal can make a company or break a company. What is your view on what can be done better?
Thank you, Anurag. First, whatever I am sharing my views is my personal views, not company's views, L&T views. A very peculiar thing I have observed in the last 3-4 years, because I'm in this profession for the last 40 years. Last 3-4 years, investor is very, very smart. They are not assessing only your balance sheet, that how much you are making profit, how strong you are. They are very smart looking into how much you are spending for the welfare of the society, how much you are spending for green energy, renewable energy, and if they are very happy about this, then they invest. And there are a couple of, in our own company, we have seen the huge investment in the last 2-3 years. So it's not only profit. Second thing, that company having many litigations, especially service matter, like litigation with large number with labor matter or environmental pollution matter, they are reluctant to invest in your company. So we'll have to keep in mind that if you expect an investment in your company, We must have minimum number of cases. Third important thing, some of panelists have said that mindset. I would say we have hundreds of laws. Do you need another 500 more law? Mediation, people say that mediation, there is no law, therefore. In last 1 year, we have compromised through mediation, even foreign arbitration. It was in arbitration. We have given a proposal, like in the Canada, Alberta is a place. So Alberta, we have done it. USA, we have done it. So it depends on the GC as well as the management. Both should be flexible. GC has to present the case that this is not a good case for you to fight it out. And management has to accept it. Yeah, we do not have a merit. So if both agree, I don't see any problem in managing this sort of thing. This is my
Thank you so much. I just want to say post-COVID, of course, profits were always important, will stay important, but planet and people have become even more important or should be more important. And second is ESG as a movement. Companies that embrace ESG in a deep way. Tomorrow, Mr. C. Kumar is having a huge symposium around sustainability and ESG at his university. Is very, very important. Manjriji, your view?
Thank you, Anurag. I think your question was more in terms of, how do we look at policy and how as an internal in-house people we would look at the changes that happen in policy and are they conducive or are they making it easy to do business or not. So I think the regulatory regime is only getting, it's evolving faster than we ever thought. And many changes that you continue to see all the time. So I think the earlier point that the panelists were making on the consistency of the laws, I think is something that all corporates also, we internally also, that is a pain point because you get your arms around one. There is a lot that you have to do internally to make sure that the company is following that or is compliant. It even means a lot in terms of getting a stakeholder buy-in. You have to get the company attuned to the fact that you're supposed to be looking at something new and different. By the time you've just managed to get that on board, you find that there is another slew of laws that have come around. And to top that up, I think it's also important in terms of consistency that the law, we are a big country and, big businesses are spread pretty much across the pan-India. Each state has a different, interpretation or different. They would be in the state list or the central list, etc., which makes it even more complicated. So I personally feel that the way the government or the regulators need to do is that I agree that we have to have some future-looking laws, certainly, that are very important. The labor codes that we recently saw, again, a big step taken by the government. Of course, I hope we see the implementation of it sooner than later. But these are areas which they are taking steps. But I think it's very important to do a few futuristic legislations, but also try and make sure that the legacy ones that we have, which are so convoluted and complex at times and highly inconsistent, from state to state also, we would like to see some more consistency come around that, because I think that makes it very easy for existing businesses to do better and makes it easy for them to comply. And of course, it also creates a better environment, business environment, more conducive environment for foreign investment into it.
Thank you so much. For example, the switch from conventional vehicles to EV vehicles, now that's a huge policy change which impacts you and your company. Also, I can say that automobile has a different issue right now. It's not about demand, it's about supply chain. There's 3 months waiting for any ordinary car and 4 or 5 months waiting for some of the brands and specific models. And it's because also of the commodity prices, steel, every commodity price has gone through the roof. Almonds were at $560, they are about $1,000. That's why if I forget something, you should know that I have not eaten almonds today because they're very expensive, just to make my point. So I agree with you. I would like to request, I want to tell you that it's the first hybrid event. In the evening, we have our 40 under 40 awards. The first year and the second year, I promise you that the hall will be full with the right kind and quality of people, and we'll stream it on all our sites. The Minister of State for Justice and Law, Shri Baghel, will be here along with our jury chair, Shri Lalit Basin, and some of the jury chairs are on the dais and give away awards. We're giving away the awards for last year, and 22 of the last year winners are coming, of course, and some are joining virtually, and 33 of this year's winners are coming, given it's the first event post-COVID, and some of the people who haven't, they'll join. We'll launch the magazine cover and the magazine, but it will reach you on Tuesday physically. We'll just launch it because we sent it to print on Thursday night, so it's only a digital copy, printed digital copy, but the offset, which is the real printing, would be in by Monday, so they'll reach you on Tuesday. I just also want to use this opportunity to tell you that our Global Legal Leaders Summit and Awards, which is the first IP that we started with, we'll announce the jury today. Of course, we'll add to the jury because I wanted to meet the timeline to announce today, and we'll have that sometime in December, around 20th, so that we are able to, before you start celebrating and go to Switzerland, Miss Anand, we are able to do that. And we will also have our GC 100 around that time, and we hope to get all the 100 GCs here in the room. Today we made a start because we got a 4-day notice from the minister, and we said, let's do it. And we, Ashima, Garima, and KJ and Tanvi should be complimenting for pulling it off and working with a mad person like me. But Mr. Karanjawala walks in, and thank you, Ryan, for coming in. I will like to request Mukesh to wrap it up, and then I'll take closing comments from everyone. Mr. Bhutani, first you, and then I'll go around the house.
I would not propose anything because I don't know whether I'm competent and authorized to do that. But I would say, one philosophical question: we should learn from our mistakes. So what is the learning coming out of the instance that I mentioned earlier, which is the Hague Tribunal Awards for Vodafone and Kane? And since both of them were driven out of tax claims, the learnings are that the decision to suspend all the bilateral investment treaty agreements was clearly not a very sensible move, number one. Number two, to take a view that many of these bilateral investment treaty agreements were executed at a time when the nation was starved of foreign investment is a wrong assumption to proceed with. I think we are actually going to be a foreign direct inward investment economy, at least for the next 2 to 3 decades, if not more. And hence we need to revisit what is, in my view, a wrongly conceptualized 2016 version of the bilateral investment treaty. The fact that there are only 3 nations that have signed a bilateral investment treaty with India, including Brazil and Belarus, and I can't even remember the third nation, is itself suggestive of a failure on part of the 2016 model to deliver a credible for bilateral investment treaty. I also feel that there are some lessons for us to learn as to how, based on the Kane and the arbitral award, the arbitral tribunals do tend to interpret the clauses, whether they have got to do with the carve-outs or whether they have got to do with the fair and equitable treatment. I also feel that it's incumbent upon us to now address the bogey of what is opposed to India's public policy, because the execution of foreign arbitral awards is becoming a challenge. And hence, I know that the Supreme Court has delivered judgments which are inconsistent, specific to the facts of the cases where it has held something is opposed to public policy, something is not opposed to public policy. I think time is ripe for the executive and the parliament to step in and come out with broader guidance. I think this is the only suggestion I would make, that learn from our past mistakes.
Thank you so much. It's always difficult. We're creatures of habit and we tend to repeat those mistakes. But I hope post-corona we know that time matters and let's correct what we need to correct in a short span of time. Ms. Anand, your closing comments.
I just take off from what Mukesh had spoken about VITs, and I do definitely think that it is high time that we entertained and had several more bilateral treaties, and we don't get into the logjam of what we have created in the past. We are an inward-looking country, no doubt. I mean, every country in the world is looking at us, and we have all these opportunities, but we can't take full advantage of that, and therefore put ourselves in a negotiation which ultimately keeps the insiders out. So I think that is the first step that we need to do. Second, I think consistency in policy, of course, we've talked about it, Anurag, at length, but consistency in law. So, of course, retrospectivity is one huge inconsistency, and there have been rollbacks on that. But we do need to develop legal systems and to continue with that, which retain consistency so that the investor knows where the buck will fall and where it will be retrieved and where he will make benefits. So this consistency policy, I think, not only in terms of business, but also in terms of sustainable development goals. Incidentally, I think we construe sustainable development goals in a very, very wide perspective. Finally, on public policy, Mukesh, just to share with you, I had taken public policy in defense, public policy in arbitration as my thesis at Harvard. And my conclusion was that India does interpret public policy in a very broad platform. We do have to narrow down. Whether we can have the government itself lay down guidelines or formulations is one part of it. But increasingly, the Supreme Court has been intervening. In fact, Vidya Drolia's judgment, which recently came, has even further narrowed it down to exclude the application by courts of interventions in arbitral awards. However, even now, there is a lot of grey area. And yes, we could do with substantial guidelines, because consistency, guidelines, and stipulations, and following those stipulations, and minimizing the time frame is some of the features that we do need.
Time and the cost. I mean, I'm sure law firms don't mind the cost, but I'm sure Hemant and Manjri ji do. Mr. Billimoria, your closing comments?
Yeah, so, well, if you have a term like public policy, which is delightfully vague, I mean, there are bound to be decisions, but I think by and large, I agree with Pinky that over the last couple of years at least, there have been a number of pronouncements, and I think now, at least if there's a foreign award, I think you can see it being enforced pretty rapidly. It's not going to hang fire in the Supreme Court like it used to. So we have made a lot of progress on this front. I think there's just one issue that I would like to touch upon very quickly to answer your question, which is, from the perspective of a foreign investor, we have a lot of vexatious litigation and vexatious prosecution. So it is widely believed in the community that, look, if you were to file a police complaint, then you would be able to apply adequate pressure to, to incentivize, so to speak, the other party to come to a quick settlement. But I think that is being misused. And you had cases.
By the way, in my opening speech in the evening, I'm going to talk about the directive/judgment which is pending about putting a camera in every police station, so that if you are, now we know who's opposing that, right? If just that happens, a lot of what happens in police stations and then becomes, what it becomes in the courts, and then increases the pendency, can be solved. One small thing, but it hasn't gone through for so many years in spite of, maybe it will go through this time.
Well, the flip side of the coin is that, look, in a democracy, if you walk into a police station and complain, then, you're saying, why isn't action being taken? That's the other.
No, but we're saying do that, put a camera.
Yeah.
Put a camera. Second, we are saying, like in the US, your lawyer is supposed to be there when I'm not a jurist or a legal professional. I'm much below average. I went to an MBA school. That too, I got in when the quality control was bad. I'm from the first batch of MDI. That's how I, lost.
Right.
So all I'm saying is that as a lay person or somebody in the business domain, if these two things happen, they can take a lot of load off the judiciary. In very simple terms, do you think these two initiatives will go through?
One cannot really say, but I think also, there's a need for the police to be trained and police reforms. So one of the reasons for delay could well be that the investigations are not done properly. So, I mean, there are two sides to every coin. It's a very complex issue. I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all solution, right? So, I think also, the courts have to be a little judicious in recognizing, and part of the problem is, of course, in the law itself, because, for example, when you talk about fraud, there is civil fraud and criminal fraud. Now, where does one draw the line, right? And in some Western jurisdictions, as a lawyer, you cannot allege fraud unless you are yourself convinced that that is something that has actually happened. So I think some of these practices is what we need to import and build in. No one-size-fits-all solution, but this problem of vexatious litigation is, in a way, anathema to
the goals we
foreign
set for
investors. I mean, there have been situations where, the global CEO of the Samsung Group was summoned, right? And of course, the courts intervened and struck it down. But I mean, you have to jump through hoops to do that. And the question is, why would you? Because imagine, what the foreign investor thinks about that.
Sure. Yes, I will take one final comment and bring Mr. Rajkumar for his
Very quick comment on this. I quite just want to support what Percy is saying, and basically to come to this, there's something called criminalization of justice and criminalization of commerce. It's very easy to go under something like cheating. 420 is one of the simplest shoe which fits all, and where almost any crime could be brought under, any civil case brought under. I have known of cases where salary having not been paid has become the subject matter of a criminal complaint, leading to substantial prosecution under 420. So I think this kind of diversion of civil/commercial courses of action into criminalization, and that process, whatever that process is, and whether the CCTVs, etc., are going to come there or not, that's one part of it. But we just can't allow that to happen and to sway simply because people want a faster resolution or a solution which is based upon harassment, extortion of a criminal process and of justice to ensure that. I do think we have to veer away from that very much. It is very, very painful and difficult to have the economy work in that fashion.
Thank you so much, Ms. Anand, for that intervention. Mr. C. Rajkumar, you have the final laugh.
All right, we are in 2021, so let's remember 1991. We are 30 years into economic reforms, and three things I feel we have a long way to go. First, I see significant distrust between the government and the private sector. This deep distrust that is prevailing with regard to the functioning of the private sector in all its forms and manifestations has led to a different type of policy-making process, which is not in the best interest of the country itself. Second, I strongly feel that we have not been able to build knowledge and capacities within the government and the law and policy-making process with regard to the new trends that are coming in regulation globally. As it has been said before, government cannot afford to be knowledge-proof. We need to build that knowledge and capacity within government, within the people who are involved in bureaucracy, within the people who are involved in regulatory bodies. Third, I think we really need to focus on a more robust and sincere consultative process when it comes to bringing out regulations, guidelines, laws that are going to ultimately impact different sectors. You can't do this so often with arbitrariness, but more importantly, irresponsibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rajkumar, for being real and specific. I'd like to wrap up by saying that I come from the media. Media has its own fair share of contributing to it, both in a negative and a positive. Today I've written a piece, and I am not a political person. I'm not in the BJP. I'm definitely not in the Congress. I'm not in the Aam Aadmi Party. No party. I mean, I have no I vote and I have a point of view which my friends know. But I wrote this piece before the CNN story, but the CNN story made sure that I published the piece today, and I would encourage you to read. I believe, of course, in April, May, June, India didn't do well in how it tackled COVID. I mean, I'm saying in a public platform, that's the reality. And CNN and BBC went out and sullied India's image. It does in fact, right? We've done okay with 1 billion vaccinations. So I've written a piece, hello CNN, BBC, and I've been watching CNN for 28 years. It was launched 30 years ago. And BBC for 27 years or 27 and a half, I've met, because of what I do in my previous life, exchange for media, I met some venerable names who ran. And so I've written, hello CNN and BBC, it's time to spotlight on India. But they're not. And then I read a headline early in the morning today on CNN, which says, billion people vaccinated, but millions without their first jab. Hello, it's like my daughter scoring 99.9% in college or school, and I'm saying, you didn't do well because you didn't do 100. So it's something, and I would encourage if you can read that, but I think we need in the Indian entrepreneurs in India get a bad name in foreign press because the foreign press is run by certain other agendas. And I can say that I know the media business. I'm a student, so I keep studying it. So I think we in the media also have to amplify the positives. That's the point I'm trying to make. There are lots of things to improve. There's no question about it. But as individuals, as a nation, we can't step forward on the negatives. We have to step forward on positive. So I'll say that, and I'll conclude the panel. Give Mr. Bhutani a big round of applause. Clapping is good for your heart muscles. If you haven't gone for a walk, it will help you. Ms. Anand, Mr. Billimoria, and Mr. C. Rajkumar. And when I grow up, I want to be like Mr. C. Rajkumar because he's a Virgo and so is our Prime Minister. Thank you so much. I want to keep to the time.